"I don't owe you or your child anything," shouted the millionaire CEO. 2 years later, he regretted it all. "Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter's family. May the Almighty wrap every woman in peace that silences every storm, grace that never fades, and strength that never bends. May every tear you've cried water the garden of your healing, and every heartbreak become a bridge toward divine restoration. You are the sunrise after sorrow, the whisper of courage in the silence, and the light that keeps love alive, even in the ruins. May your home overflow with safety, your path glow with purpose, and your heart bloom with unshakable faith. My precious family, your kindness is a force heaven recognizes. Your compassion rewrites destinies. A like is a spark of faith. A comment is a voice of courage. This is Mission 1000 likes for every woman who was left in pain, stood in faith, and rose again in grace. If your heart still hopes, like this video. If your soul still rises, comment. Power to women. I don't owe you or your child anything. The words detonated in the boardroom like grenades, each syllable a piece of shrapnel that found its mark in Pearl White's chest. She stood frozen in the doorway, her hand still gripping the brass handle, her other arm instinctively wrapping around the swell of her stomach, where life grew in secret defiance of this moment. The man behind the mahogany desk bore the face of someone she'd loved for 5 years, but his eyes held the cold calculation of a stranger executing a necessary amputation. Ray Collins rose from his leather chair, his 6-foot frame casting shadows across architectural blueprints that Pearl had drawn with her own hands during midnight sessions when the world slept and only their ambitions kept watch. Those blueprints represented something they'd built together, structure by structure, dream by dream, back when his promises tasted like truth and the future stretched before them like an open canvas. But Pearl had seen the change coming, even if she'd refused to believe it. At Constance's funeral, Ray's in-laws had surrounded him like a wall of old money and older prejudices. The Harrington family, whose wealth stretched back generations, whose name opened doors that talent alone never could. Pearl had watched them whisper in Ray's ear, had seen him flinch at whatever poison they were dripping into his grief. She'd noticed how he avoided her eyes during the service, how he stood with the Harringtons as if their approval was oxygen and he was drowning without it. Constance had warned her once, during one of their final hospital conversations. "They'll come for him when I'm gone, my family. They'll tell him you're not good enough, that you're after his money that I never approved. Don't let them win, Pearl. Ray is weak when it comes to their opinion of him. He always has been." Pearl had kissed Constance's hand and promised. But she hadn't understood how deep that weakness ran, hadn't realized that Ray's love for her existed only in spaces where the Harrington judgment couldn't reach. In his office after hours, in hotels where no one knew their names, never at family gatherings, never anywhere his late wife's relatives might see and disapprove. "You think because we shared something that I'm responsible for whatever mess you've gotten yourself into?" His voice climbed higher, echoing off walls that had witnessed their whispered plans for projects that would reshape skylines. "My wife just died 6 weeks ago, Pearl, 6 weeks. And here you come with your accusations and your demands, like I owe you something beyond the professional courtesy I've already shown." Professional courtesy. The phrase hung in the air like poisoned fruit. Pearl's throat constricted, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper that somehow carried the weight of every betrayed promise between them. "Constance knew about us. Ray, she gave us her blessing before she passed. She made me promise to take care of you when she was gone. She held my hand in that hospital room and told me she was grateful someone would love you when she couldn't anymore. She warned me about your family, about how they'd try to destroy this. But she believed you were stronger than their judgment." Ray's face twisted, something ugly and desperate flooding his features. He moved around the desk with jerky, puppet-like movements, his hands gesturing wildly as if trying to physically swat away the truth. Pearl saw it then, the thing Constance had tried to make her understand. Ray wasn't just grieving, he was terrified. Terrified of what the Harringtons thought, of losing their approval, of being seen as the kind of man who moved on too quickly, who chose a woman without pedigree over his late wife's memory. Don't you dare speak her name. Don't you dare use her memory to manipulate me. Her family has made it very clear what you are. A predator who saw opportunity in a dying woman's husband. They've shown me documentation, Pearl, evidence of how you've been positioning yourself, worming your way into my life, my work, my grief. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Pearl's knees weakened, but she forced herself to remain standing. To meet his eyes, even as tears blurred her vision. She'd known his wife's family was wealthy, connected to the kind of old money that built cities and crushed anyone who threatened their legacy. She'd watched them descend on Ray at the funeral, like vultures claiming carrion, their sympathy laced with poison about inappropriate relationships and fortune hunters. But she'd believed Ray would see through it, would remember the 5 years they'd spent building something real amid the tragedy of Constance's illness. "You don't believe that," she said, her voice steadier now, forged in the heat of disbelief. "You know what we had? What we have. I never asked you for anything, Ray. I just wanted to tell you about what? Your pregnancy?" He laughed, the sound harsh and brittle. "Let me guess. You'll claim it's mine. You'll want support, recognition, maybe a piece of what I've built. Well, I've been advised by my lawyers to have absolutely no contact with you beyond what I'm legally required to provide as your former employer. And yes, Pearl, former employer, this conversation constitutes your termination. Effective immediately." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Pearl's feet. "Former employer." The words registered slowly, each implication spreading like cracks in ice. Her work, her reputation, her entire career had been built under Ray's guidance. Every major project bore both their signatures, their combined vision. Without his recommendation, without access to the portfolio they'd created together, she had nothing. "You're firing me." She said it as a statement, watching the reality settle over both of them like ash. "After everything we built together. After 5 years of giving you not just my talent, but every piece of myself. After Constance asked me to love you. You're firing me because you're more afraid of what the Harringtons think than you are committed to being the man you promised you were." Ray's jaw clenched, a muscle jumping beneath his skin. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or regret, but it drowned quickly beneath something harder, colder. The fear won. It always won with him. "I'm protecting my reputation and my late wife's memory. You'll receive 2 weeks severance, standard termination procedure. I suggest you use that time to find other employment and refrain from making any public statements about our professional relationship or anything else. My lawyers are very thorough, Pearl. Don't test their reach." The threat hung between them, crystal clear. Pearl felt something fundamental break inside her chest. Some last fragile bridge between who she'd been and who she would have to become. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and spoke with a dignity that surprised even herself. "I came here to tell you that you're going to be a father, that despite everything we've endured, something beautiful survived. But you're right about one thing, Ray Collins. You don't owe me anything. You just owed yourself the chance to be someone worth loving. Constance saw that man. I saw that man. Apparently, he died with her. Or maybe he never existed. Maybe you were always this person, just better at hiding it when the Harringtons weren't watching." She turned toward the door, her hand trembling on the handle. Ray's voice stopped her, quieter now, almost pleading. "Pearl, wait. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." She looked back at him over her shoulder, memorizing his face for the last time. "You meant every word. And I'll remember that on every difficult night ahead. I'll remember that you chose your reputation over your own child, over me, over the man you could have been. I'll remember that you were too weak to stand up to people who've been dead inside for generations." The door closed behind her. with a whisper, not a slam. Pearl walked through the office she'd called home for 5 years, past colleagues who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes, past the receptionist who'd always saved her coffee in the mornings. Her personal items had already been boxed, sitting in the lobby like evidence at a crime scene. Someone had been efficient. The Harringtons, probably. They were good at eliminating problems. She carried the box to her car, placed it carefully in the passenger seat, and drove away from the building that held every blueprint of the future she'd imagined. Halfway home, she pulled into an empty parking lot and allowed herself to brake. Her hands shook as she pulled the pregnancy test from her purse, the one she'd taken that morning, the one that had shown 2 lines that changed everything. She'd been so happy driving to Ray's office, so certain that despite the tragedy of Constance's death, despite the grief, they would face this new chapter together. The box of her belongings stared at her from the passenger seat. 5 years of her life reduced to objects that fit in a single container. She placed both hands on her stomach, feeling the flutter of life that didn't yet know it had been rejected before drawing its first breath. "I'll keep you safe," she whispered to the child growing inside her, unaware that she carried not 1 heartbeat but 3. "I'll keep you safe, even if I have to burn myself to ashes to do it." She didn't know then about the phone calls Ray would make, the whispers he would spread through professional circles, the way her name would become synonymous with scandal and opportunism. She didn't know that the blacklist was already forming, that every door she tried to open would close before she reached it. She didn't know that in 2 days she would discover 3 babies growing where she expected one, or that her savings would evaporate like morning dew beneath the heat of legal fees and medical bills. All she knew was that the man she'd loved had looked at her with a stranger's eyes and chosen comfort over courage, chosen the Harrington approval over his own child. And somewhere deep in her bones, in the marrow of who she was, Pearl White made a decision that would define everything that followed. She would survive this. She would survive him. And whatever came next, she would face it with a spine made of steel and a heart that refused to break completely. Because breaking completely was a luxury she could no longer afford. Chapter 2. The Garden in the Wasteland. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. Pearl lay in a bed with sheets that had been washed too many times, their fabric worn thin as the patience of the nurses who rushed past her door. Her sister Opal sat in the corner, her face drawn with exhaustion and something darker that Pearl recognized as fear. The kind of fear that came from watching someone you love step off a cliff and knowing you couldn't catch them, only watch them fall. Opal had her own fresh bruise blooming across her left cheekbone, poorly covered with makeup that had been applied in the dark. Pearl had seen it the moment her sister arrived, had opened her mouth to say something, but Opal's warning glare had silenced her. Not now, not here, later, always later with Opal's situation. As if postponing confrontation would somehow make the problem disappear. 3, the doctor had said, her voice matter-of-fact as she pointed to the ultrasound screen, where 3 distinct forms pulsed with stubborn life. Triplets! Your body's been working overtime. Pearl had stared at those 3 heartbeats and felt something shift inside her that had nothing to do with the babies pressing against her ribs. 3 mouths to feed. 3 lives depending on someone who couldn't even feed herself. 3 daughters, because somehow she knew they were girls who would inherit a world that had already rejected them before they drew breath. The labor came hard and fast, ripping through her like punishment for crimes she'd never committed. Opal held her hand and whispered encouragement that sounded hollow in the fluorescent glare. No flowers decorated the room. No proud father paced the hallway. Just Pearl and her sister and 3 babies fighting their way into a world that didn't want them. When they finally arrived, the nurses placed them on Pearl's chest one by one. 3 perfect faces, each distinct despite their shared beginning. The first had fierce eyes that seemed to challenge the universe even in those first moments. The second had a gentleness that Pearl recognized from somewhere deep in her own buried past. The third studied everything with an intensity that spoke of hunger for something beyond milk and warmth. Names? The nurse asked, pen poised over paperwork that would make their existence official. Pearl looked at these 3 lives she'd created, these 3 flowers blooming in the wasteland of her circumstances. She thought of her grandmother's garden, back when the world still made sense, back when flowers grew because you loved them and not because you forced them to survive. Azalea, she whispered, touching the first baby's cheek. Strong, resilient, capable of thriving in harsh conditions. Magnolia, for the second, southern grace persisting despite everything. Dahlia, for the third, complex and layered and reaching toward the sun. Opal squeezed her hand. Beautiful names for beautiful girls. But Pearl, how are you going to— I don't know, Pearl cut her off, the honesty sharp as glass. I don't know how I'm going to feed them or clothe them or give them anything close to what they deserve. But I'm going to try. Every single day I'm going to try. The trying started immediately. Pearl's savings disappeared into medical bills that multiplied like weeds. Her apartment lease ended while she was still in the hospital. Her belongings packed by a landlord, tired of waiting for rent she couldn't pay. Opal took them in, cramming Pearl and 3 newborns into an apartment barely big enough for 1 person. The walls were thin as paper. Sirens provided the soundtrack to their nights. Neighbors fought and loved and lived their lives at volumes that made privacy a cruel joke. Pearl took whatever work she could find. Night shifts cleaning office buildings, where executives left half-eaten lunches in trash cans while she skipped meals to stretch the formula budget. Morning shifts at a laundromat, where she folded other people's clean clothes while her own daughters wore outfits washed so many times the fabric had lost all memory of its original color. Weekend hours doing bookkeeping for businesses that paid cash under the table, asking no questions about qualifications or references or why someone with her education was desperate enough to work for minimum wage. She architected nothing but survival plans. Budget spreadsheets replaced blueprints. Grocery lists became her only creative outlet. She learned which stores marked down their bread on which days, which food banks asked the fewest questions, which churches offered diaper assistance without requiring attendance at services where they'd pray over her poor choices. Opal watched the triplets during Pearl's overnight shifts, but Opal had her own chaos to manage. A boyfriend who came and went like weather patterns, predictable in his unpredictability. Sometimes he brought groceries, sometimes he brought bruises. Pearl wanted to tell her sister to leave him, but who was she to give advice about men? She'd loved a man who'd thrown her away like trash. Then one morning, Pearl came home from her night shift to find Opal packing a bag with shaking hands. The boyfriend was passed out on the couch, reeking of alcohol and rage that had burned itself out. Opal's lip was split, her eyes swollen shut, and something in her had finally broken in the right direction. "I'm done," Opal whispered, throwing clothes into a duffel bag. "I'm going to stay with Aunt Raina upstate. She said I could work at her restaurant, get back on my feet. Pearl, I'm sorry. I know you need me, but I can't do this anymore. If I stay, he's going to kill me eventually." Pearl pulled her sister into her arms, careful of the bruises. "Go, you should have left months ago. I'll figure something out with the girls." "I'll send money when I can," Opal promised, tears streaming down her battered face. "And when I'm stable, when I'm better, maybe I can help more. But right now I'm just drowning, and I'm pulling you down with me." They stood together in that cramped apartment. 2 sisters who'd survived their own difficult childhood, now facing different versions of the same struggle. Pearl helped Opal pack, gave her what little cash she had saved for emergencies, and watched her sister leave before the boyfriend woke up. It was the right choice, the only choice. But it meant Pearl was truly alone now, with 3 infants and no safety net. The girls grew despite everything. Azalea learned to crawl first, pushing forward with determination that made Pearl's chest ache. Magnolia followed at her own pace, gentle and unhurried, stopping to examine dust motes floating in sunbeams that slipped through threadbare curtains. Dahlia watched everything, absorbing the world like a sponge, her eyes tracking patterns Pearl couldn't see. They shared one bedroom, one bunk bed built for two but holding three. Pearl would stand in the doorway after her shifts and watch them sleep, their breathing synchronized, their small bodies pressed together for warmth and comfort. Sometimes she cried. Most times she just stood there, memorizing their faces, storing these moments against the fear that tomorrow would somehow take even this away. Meanwhile, Ray Collins' face appeared on magazine covers. Pearl saw him once in a waiting room, his smile bright on glossy paper, some headline about visionary leadership or innovative design. She turned the magazine face down and walked away before anyone could see her hands shaking. He'd moved on, built his empire, convinced himself, probably, that he'd made the right choice. Pearl burned her old portfolio. Every blueprint, every sketch, every piece of the architect she'd been went into the dumpster behind her new apartment building. She couldn't afford to mourn what she'd lost. Mourning was for people with time and energy to spare, and Pearl had neither. She had 3 daughters who needed her to be functional, to be present, to be enough, even when enough felt impossible. "Mama," Azalea said one morning, her first word emerging clear and strong. Pearl had been getting ready for her shift at the laundromat, moving on autopilot, exhausted down to her bones. But that word stopped her cold. She turned to see her daughter looking at her with those fierce eyes, reaching toward her with small hands that already knew how to fight for what they needed. "Mama," Azalea repeated, and Magnolia and Dahlia echoed her, their voices joining in imperfect harmony. Pearl dropped to her knees and pulled them close, breathing in the scent of cheap baby shampoo and innocence that wouldn't last. They called her Mama. They didn't know their father had thrown them away before they existed. They didn't know the world saw them as mistakes, complications, burdens. They just knew her. And somehow, impossibly, that had to be enough. Months later, Opal called. Her voice sounded different, stronger. She'd left the boyfriend permanently, was working steadily at their aunt's restaurant, had started therapy through a domestic violence support program. She sent what money she could, not much but something. More importantly, she sent hope, proof that escape was possible, that survival could eventually transform into actual living. Pearl hung up the phone and looked at her daughters, now pulling themselves up on furniture, exploring their small world with fearless curiosity. Opal had found her way out. Pearl would find hers too. They would all survive this. They had to. Chapter 3. The Inheritance of Absence. The question came on a playground where the equipment was held together with rust and hope. Azalea stood with her hands on her hips, her second-hand dress 2 sizes too small, her shoes held together with duct tape that Pearl had tried to color match with marker. A group of children clustered nearby, comparing notes about some father-daughter event at school. "Why don't we have a daddy?" Azalea's voice cut through the afternoon air, direct and uncompromising. Pearl had been sitting on a bench, watching all 3 of her daughters navigate the complicated social mathematics of childhood poverty. Magnolia was drawing in the dirt with a stick, creating patterns that somehow seemed too beautiful for their surroundings. Dahlia sat alone on the swings, not swinging, just thinking in that intense way she had. But Azalea had always been the one to ask the questions everyone else was afraid to voice. Pearl's heart performed that familiar clench, the one that happened whenever the ghost of Ray Collins wandered too close to their carefully constructed life. She'd known this moment would come, had rehearsed answers in her head during long night shifts, but none of those rehearsals had prepared her for the actual moment, for 3 sets of eyes turning toward her with the kind of hunger that food couldn't satisfy. "Come here, all of you," Pearl said, her voice steadier than she felt. They gathered around her, 3 versions of the same miracle, each distinct in ways that broke and healed her simultaneously. She looked at their faces and saw Ray in the angle of their jaws, in the way their eyes reflected light, in the stubborn set of their shoulders. But she also saw herself, saw the survival instinct she'd passed down like a genetic inheritance more valuable than money. "Your father," she began, then paused, choosing her words like picking through a minefield. "Your father was someone I loved very much, someone I believed loved me too. But when you were coming, when he found out about you, he got lost in grief and fear. He made a choice. He walked away from us." "Why?" Magnolia's voice was soft, but the question hit hard. "Because sometimes people aren't strong enough to be who they need to be," Pearl said. "Because he let other voices tell him what to think, instead of trusting his own heart. Because he was more afraid of what people would say than he was committed to doing what was right." "That's weak," Azalea pronounced, her voice filled with the kind of judgment only children can deliver with such purity. "If he couldn't fight for us, we don't need him." "But we didn't do anything wrong," Dahlia said, her tone analytical, trying to solve an equation that didn't add up. "We weren't even born yet. How could he reject us before he even met us?" Pearl pulled them closer, feeling their small bodies press against hers, their warmth anchoring her against the tide of rage and sorrow that always threatened to drown her when she thought about Ray's betrayal. "You didn't do anything wrong. Listen to me, all three of you. You are not mistakes. You are not burdens. You are not the problem. He was the problem. His weakness, his fear, his choice. None of that has anything to do with your worth." They absorbed this in their own ways. Adalia's face hardened into determination, a warrior being born right there on a broken playground. Magnolia's eyes filled with tears she didn't let fall, already learning to bury pain beneath beauty. Dahlia's expression went distant, calculating, her mind working through implications and possibilities. That conversation changed something fundamental in their family. The girls stopped asking about their father, but his absence became a presence they each carried differently. Azalea became their protector, fighting battles on playgrounds and in classrooms against anyone who mocked their circumstances. She came home with bloody knees and fierce pride, collecting bruises like badges of honor. Magnolia retreated into art, filling notebooks with drawings that Pearl couldn't afford, but somehow always appeared. She drew gardens and flowers and landscapes that existed only in her imagination. Sometimes Pearl caught glimpses of a figure in those drawings, always in the background, always faceless, always walking away. Dahlia discovered the library. She read everything, devouring books about successful people, studying their paths like maps to treasure. She started keeping a journal filled with observations about what separated people who made it from people who didn't. Pearl found it once and read entries that made her weep in the bathroom with the water, running so the girls wouldn't hear. Pearl got promoted to office manager at a small construction firm. It wasn't architecture, but it was steady. The pay increase meant they could finally leave Opal's old apartment, move into their own place. Nothing fancy, but the girls got their own rooms. Small rooms, barely bigger than closets, but their own. Pearl hung her old architectural drawings in the living room, framed in cheap frames from discount stores, turning failure into decoration. She watched her daughters grow into themselves, each becoming someone remarkable despite having nothing. Azalea's fierceness protected her sisters from a world that would have crushed them otherwise. Magnolia's gentleness reminded them that survival didn't have to mean becoming hard all the way through. Dahlia's brilliance offered hope that maybe, just maybe, they could climb out of the hole Ray's rejection had thrown them into. Some nights Pearl lay awake wondering if Ray ever thought about them. If he ever wondered whether he'd had a son or daughter, whether that child shared his eyes, or his smile, or his talent for seeing how spaces could be transformed. She doubted it. Men like Ray Collins didn't waste time on might-have-beens. They moved forward, built empires, convinced themselves that the collateral damage of their choices was somehow necessary. But Pearl couldn't afford that luxury. Every time she looked at her daughters, she saw the cost of his choice written in their second-hand clothes, and their too thin frames, and their eyes that had seen too much struggle too soon. She saw what he'd thrown away, and the waste of it burned in her chest like swallowed fire. "We're going to be okay," she told them one night, tucking them into their separate beds in their separate rooms, this small victory over poverty that had cost her everything. "We know, Mama," Azalea said. "We've got you. We've got each other. We don't need him." Pearl kissed their foreheads and retreated to her own room, where she allowed herself 5 minutes of grief. Just 5 minutes to mourn the life they should have had, the father they deserved, the ease that money could have bought. Then she dried her eyes and returned to the budget spreadsheet that never quite balanced, the architectural plans for survival that she redrew every week, trying to find a way to build something stable on a foundation made of sand and spite and stubborn refusal to surrender. Chapter 4. The Prodigy and the Price. The envelope arrived on a morning when Pearl's car had decided to start only after 10 minutes of coaxing and prayer. She'd been running late for work, trying to get all 3 girls fed and out the door, when Dahlia appeared in the kitchen with an expression Pearl had never seen before. Hope and terror mixed in equal measure, a cocktail too strong for someone so young to be drinking. "I won something," Dahlia said, holding out a thick cream envelope that looked expensive against the chipped laminate of their kitchen counter. Pearl took it with hands still wet from washing dishes. Inside was an invitation, printed on paper that felt like it cost more than their grocery budget. Dahlia had won a citywide competition. The prize included an interview for a full scholarship at an elite private school, the kind of school Pearl had once dreamed of designing buildings for, back when her dreams included blueprints instead of grocery lists. She read it twice, then 3 times, waiting for the catch. There was always a catch, but this seemed real, legitimate, an opportunity blooming in the wasteland of their circumstances, like the flowers her daughters were named for. "When's the interview?" Pearl asked, her mind already calculating what this would require. "Next week," Dahlia said, and her voice trembled. "Mama, I know we can't afford—" "Stop!" Pearl cut her off. "Don't you dare finish that sentence. We'll figure it out." Figuring it out meant selling her laptop, the one she'd managed to save for over 3 years, meant picking up extra shifts at the construction firm, meant visiting thrift stores until she found a dress that looked decent enough, that fit Dahlia's thin frame without screaming poverty quite so loudly. They practiced interview questions until late into the night, Pearl channeling the professional she used to be, teaching Dahlia how to speak the language of success, even when you were fluent in survival. The interview was held in a building that made Pearl's chest hurt. Stone and glass, and the kind of architecture she'd once dreamed of creating. They walked through hallways lined with portraits of distinguished alumni, past classrooms where students bent over work at desks that cost more than Pearl's monthly rent. Dahlia's hand trembled in hers. "You belong here," Pearl whispered. "You're smarter than any of them. Don't let them make you feel small." The interview lasted an hour. Pearl sat in a waiting room with other parents who wore clothes that fit properly, who drove cars that started on the first try, who looked at her with that particular mixture of pity and superiority that made her want to scream. She kept her spine straight and her face calm, and pretended she belonged in this world that had expelled her like a foreign object. When Dahlia emerged, Pearl couldn't read her expression. They walked to the car in silence. Only when they were safely inside, doors closed against the world, did Dahlia speak. "I think it went well," she said, her voice small. "But Mama, did you see those other kids? They had tutors. They've been to places. They speak languages. I'm so far behind." Pearl grabbed her daughter's face between her hands, forcing Dahlia to meet her eyes. "You survived poverty. You survived having a father who threw you away before you were born. You survived watching your mother work 3 jobs and pretending you didn't hear her cry. Those other kids, they've never had to survive anything. You're not behind. You're ahead. You just can't see it yet." The acceptance letter came while Pearl was at work. Opal called her crying, reading it over the phone. Full scholarship. books included, uniforms provided. Dahlia had done it. She'd punched a hole in the ceiling of their circumstances and proven that brilliance could survive even in darkness. Pearl left work early, drove home too fast, burst through the door to find her daughters celebrating. Azalea had skipped her shift at the fast food place where she worked, despite being too young, lying about her age because the family needed money. Magnolia had picked flowers from somewhere, arranged them in a water glass like a trophy. Dahlia sat in the center of the chaos, holding the letter like it might disappear if she let go. But celebration gave way to reality quickly. The scholarship covered tuition, but not the laptop every student needed, not the special calculator for advanced classes, not the fees for field trips and activities, and all the hidden costs that came with existing in a world designed for people with money. Pearl took out loans she couldn't afford, worked longer hours, stopped eating lunch so Dahlia could have supplies. Dahlia thrived academically. Pearl had known she would. Her daughter's mind was a machine built for consuming information and transforming it into understanding. But the social cost was higher than Pearl had anticipated. Dahlia came home with stories about classmates whose parents took them skiing, whose vacation photos showed beaches Pearl had only seen in magazines. She tried to hide how much it hurt, but Pearl knew. She knew every shade of pain her daughters carried because she carried the same weight in different colors. Then Azalea dropped out of school. Just stopped going one day and got a job instead. She came home and announced it like it was already decided, her jaw set in that stubborn line that reminded Pearl of herself. "We need money for Dahlia's school," Azalea said. "I'm good at working, not good at sitting in classrooms learning stuff that doesn't matter." "This makes sense," Pearl wanted to scream, wanted to shake her daughter and tell her that education was the only way out. But she was too tired, and Azalea was right about the money. And sometimes surviving meant making choices that broke your heart. "Just until things get better," Pearl bargained, knowing things never got better. "They just got different." "Sure, Mama," Azalea said. But her eyes held knowledge beyond her years. She knew she was sacrificing herself. She knew Dahlia was the one with a chance. She knew Pearl couldn't save all three of them, so she was saving herself the trouble of being saved. Magnolia was quieter about her own sacrifice. She got accepted into an arts program, something Pearl only discovered by accident when she found the acceptance letter hidden in Magnolia's room. Her daughter had turned it down without asking, without fighting, just let it go, like releasing a balloon into the sky. "Why didn't you tell me?" Pearl confronted her, waving the letter like evidence. Magnolia looked at her with those calm eyes, old beyond their years. "Because I knew you'd try to make it work. Because Dahlia needs her chance. Because I'm okay, Mama. I like working with flowers. I like the quiet." Pearl wanted to argue, wanted to find a way to give all three of them everything. But she was one person with limited hours and even more limited resources, and every choice meant someone losing. She'd become an architect of triage, deciding which dreams could be saved and which had to be abandoned. She held Magnolia and apologized, and her daughter hugged her back and said there was nothing to forgive. But Pearl felt the weight of that forgiveness like stones in her pockets, dragging her deeper into the guilt that was her constant companion. Every good thing one daughter gained came at the cost of something another daughter lost. That was the mathematics of poverty, the brutal equation that never balanced. Chapter 5. The Collision Course. The phone rang while Pearl was elbow-deep in paperwork, trying to make sense of a budget that refused to cooperate. Her boss stood in the doorway, practically vibrating with excitement. "Pearl, we got it. The Collins contract! This is huge for us." The name hit her like a physical blow. The pen in her hand clattered to the desk. Her boss, oblivious, continued talking about square footage and timelines and opportunity, but Pearl heard none of it through the roaring in her ears. Collins Enterprises, Ray's company. The empire he'd built while she'd been scraping together survival. For years, she'd successfully avoided any professional contact with his world. The construction firm she worked for handled small projects, residential work, nothing that would intersect with the commercial developments Ray specialized in. But apparently, his company had expanded, started a community initiative, and her firm had somehow landed the contract for preliminary site work. Pearl, did you hear me? This could mean bonuses, real ones. We need to coordinate with their head office starting next week. Real bonuses. The kind that could mean Dahlia wouldn't have to choose between joining the robotics club or eating properly. The kind that could replace Azalea's work shoes that were held together with hope and stubbornness. The kind that could let Magnolia take even one art class at the community center she walked past every day, with longing in her eyes. Yes, Pearl heard herself say. That's wonderful. Her boss left, still talking about opportunity and growth. Pearl sat at her desk and felt the past and present collide, like cars on a highway. She'd spent years building a life that never intersected with Ray's. Years convincing herself she was over the betrayal, over the rage, over the fantasy of confronting him with the evidence of his cruelty. Now the universe was forcing them into the same orbit. She could quit, should quit. But Dahlia's school fees were due. Azalea needed new work boots. Magnolia had been sleeping with a coat over her blankets because Pearl couldn't afford to run the heat higher. She needed this job, needed the bonus this contract would bring. Pride was a luxury she'd surrendered the day she'd started cleaning offices for minimum wage. Pearl spent the rest of the day in a fog, mechanically completing tasks while her mind spun through scenarios. What if Ray showed up? What if he saw her? What if he tried to speak to her? The questions multiplied like bacteria, infecting every thought until she couldn't breathe properly. She left work early, claiming a headache that wasn't entirely a lie. In her car, she sat with her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. She'd survived everything Ray had thrown at her. She could survive this too. She had to. That night she gathered her daughters and told them about the contract. She didn't mention Ray's name. They knew their father was connected to some big company. Pearl had answered their questions with strategic vagueness over the years, but she'd never specified which one. She told herself she was protecting them. In truth, she was protecting herself from having to speak his name in her own home. That's great, Mama, Dahlia said, but her eyes were sharp. Too sharp. Pearl recognized that look. Her daughter was filing information away, connecting dots Pearl hadn't realized she'd left visible. Azalea was more direct. Is this going to be a problem? You look like someone just told you bad news, disguised as good news. It's fine, Pearl said, forcing brightness into her voice. Just a big project, more responsibility. But the bonus will help us. Magnolia watched her quietly, those artist's eyes seeing too much. But she said nothing, just reached across the table and squeezed Pearl's hand. Sometimes Magnolia's silence said more than other people's speeches. The first meeting was scheduled in a conference room that felt too small and too large simultaneously. Pearl arrived early, prepared to treat this as professional obligation. She'd rehearsed her poker face, practiced her neutral tone, built walls around the part of herself that still remembered loving Ray Collins before he became the villain in her daughter's origin story. She'd even prepared an escape plan. If things got too intense, if seeing Ray proved impossible, she'd claim illness and leave. Her boss would understand, she hoped. But all her preparation crumbled when he walked through the door. Not Ray, not yet. Just his assistant, carrying plans and paperwork. Pearl breathed again. Stupid to think he'd attend preliminary meetings. Men at his level didn't concern themselves with details. They had people for that. The meetings continued weekly. Pearl coordinated schedules, reviewed plans, interfaced with Ray's team without ever seeing Ray himself. She started to relax, started to believe she could navigate this without ever having to face him. The bonus would come through. They'd finish the project. Life would continue in its careful equilibrium of survival and sacrifice. She even found herself enjoying the work. It wasn't architecture, not really, but it was closer than she'd been in years. She got to review designs, offer input on structural elements, use pieces of the education Ray had helped destroy. There was bitter irony in contributing to his project, but Pearl took satisfaction in being good at it, in proving she still had the skills he'd tried to bury. Her co-workers noticed the change in her. "You're different on this project," Linda commented. "More engaged. Like you actually care about the work." Pearl did care. Despite everything, despite Ray, she still loved the process of building things, of turning empty space into something functional and beautiful. She'd buried that love for years, but it surfaced now like muscle memory, surprising her with its persistence. Then Ray decided to personally oversee the project. Some sentimental reason about honoring his late wife's memory by developing the neighborhood where she grew up. Pearl learned this from her boss, who mentioned it casually while they prepared for what was supposed to be just another routine meeting. "Collins himself is coming today. Wants to walk the site, make sure the vision aligns with his wife's legacy. Great opportunity for us to impress him." Pearl's hands went numb. She had 10 minutes. 10 minutes to prepare for seeing the man who'd destroyed her life, who'd rejected their daughters, who'd gone on to build everything while she'd scrambled for crumbs. 10 minutes to construct a version of herself who could survive this encounter without screaming or weeping or setting his expensive suit on fire. She locked herself in the bathroom and stared at her reflection. The woman looking back was older than the one Ray had known, harder, lines around her eyes that came from exhaustion, not laughter. Grey threading through her hair that she couldn't afford to color. She looked like what she was, a survivor. Someone who'd endured what should have destroyed her. Good, Pearl thought. Let him see what he did. Let him see the cost of his cowardice written on my face. When he walked into her office, her small, cramped office that smelled like old coffee and crushed ambition, time fractured, he looked older, grayer. But those eyes that had once looked at her with something resembling love, were unchanged. He scanned the room, his gaze sliding past her once, twice, then snapping back like a rubber band pulled too tight. Pearl? Her name in his mouth sounded like a question, like he wasn't sure she was real. She stood behind her desk, grateful for the furniture between them, for any barrier against the flood of emotions threatening to drown her. "Mr. Collins," she said, her voice cold and professional. "We have the site plans ready for your review." The meeting happened. Other people were present. Pearl presented her work with the competence she'd honed over years of surviving impossible circumstances. Ray stammered through his part, distracted, his eyes returning to her face again and again, like touching a wound to confirm it still hurt. When the others filed out, he lingered. Pearl kept her back to him, organizing papers that didn't need organizing. "Pearl, I didn't know you worked here. If I had known—" "What?" She turned to face him, her anger a living thing that had waited years for this moment. "If you'd known what? You would have chosen a different contractor. Made sure our paths never crossed? Don't worry, Mr. Collins. I'm very good at my job. Your project will be handled professionally." "That's not what I meant." He moved closer, and Pearl stepped back instinctively. "I just meant, how have you been? What happened after you fired me and destroyed my reputation? After you made sure no architecture firm in this city would hire me? After you threw me away like garbage?" Her voice stayed level, but each word landed like a punch. "I survived. That's what happened. I survived. Pearl, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was grieving and angry and listening to the wrong people. If I could take it back—" "But you can't," she interrupted. "Sorry doesn't give me back the career you destroyed. Sorry doesn't erase years of poverty. Sorry is just a word people use when they want forgiveness without having to face consequences." He flinched like she'd struck him. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but please let me help. I have resources. You could leave," Pearl said. "You could conduct your meetings professionally and leave me alone. I don't need your help. I don't need your guilt. I need you to stay out of my life." Ray opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "The baby. Did you—" "That's none of your business," Pearl cut him off, her voice sharp as broken glass. "You made it none of your business. Now please leave my office." He left, but Pearl knew he'd be back. The project would take months. She'd sentenced herself to weekly encounters with the man who'd fathered her daughters and abandoned them all. She leaned against her desk and tried to remember how to breathe, tried to remember why she'd thought she could do this. The answer came in three faces she saw every time she closed her eyes. Azalea, Magnolia, Dahlia. She was doing this for them. She would do anything for them, even face the man who'd failed them before they were born. Later, driving home, Pearl's hand still shook on the steering wheel. She'd done it. She'd faced Ray and survived. But survival felt hollow, tasted like ash. Because now she'd have to do it again, and again, week after week until the project ended. The bonus suddenly seemed inadequate payment for the emotional toll of existing in Ray Collins' orbit. But Pearl had never had the luxury of walking away from money her daughters needed. So she would endure. She would survive, just like she always had. Chapter 6. The Reckoning Delayed. Ray Collins became a regular presence in Pearl's professional life, like a chronic illness she couldn't cure. He attended every site meeting, every progress review, every opportunity to orbit her carefully constructed world. Pearl maintained her professional facade, speaking to him only when necessary, keeping every interaction brief and cold. But she felt his eyes on her constantly, heavy with unspoken questions and belated regret. Her co-workers noticed, started making comments about how the big boss seemed unusually invested in their small project. But how he looked at Pearl like he was trying to solve a puzzle missing half its pieces. Pearl deflected with efficient politeness, burying herself in work, building walls with paperwork and professional distance. But Ray was relentless in his own way, not pushing exactly, just present. He started arriving early to meetings, lingering after they ended. He asked questions about her life that she refused to answer. He tried to apologize in ways that made her want to throw things, as if sorry could rebuild the life he'd demolished. "How have you been?" he asked once, after everyone else had left a site review. Pearl looked at him like he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Professionally efficient. Is there anything else you need regarding the project?" "That's not what I meant." "I know what you meant. I'm choosing not to answer." She gathered her papers and walked away, feeling his stare follow her like touch. These encounters left her shaken in ways she couldn't afford. At night, she lay awake analyzing every word, every look, trying to understand what he wanted from her. Absolution? Forgiveness? Some narrative where he wasn't the villain? The worst part was that some treacherous piece of her remembered loving him, remembered the man he'd been before grief and fear turned him into someone capable of cruelty. That piece whispered dangerous things about second chances and healing. Pearl strangled that voice. She couldn't afford softness toward the man who'd rejected her daughters, because that's what kept her anger sharp. Not what he'd done to her. She'd survived that, built herself back from ruins. But what he'd done to 3 innocent lives. To Azalea working full-time when she should be in school. To Magnolia surrendering her dreams without a fight. To Dahlia excelling at that expensive school, while knowing every opportunity came at the cost of her family's sacrifices. Her boss started asking questions, nothing direct, but pointed enough that Pearl understood the subtext. Why was Ray Collins so personally invested in this project? What was their history? Pearl gave vague answers about having worked together years ago, keeping her voice neutral, praying the conversation would end before she had to lie outright. The other women in the office watched with a mixture of curiosity and envy. They saw a successful, wealthy man paying attention to their colleague and assumed romance. Assumed Pearl was playing coy. They didn't see the way Pearl's hands shook after Ray left meetings. Didn't notice how she stayed late to avoid walking to her car at the same time he did. Didn't understand that his presence was violation, not courtship. One co-worker, Linda, cornered Pearl in the break room. "You know he's interested, right? A man like that doesn't show up to every meeting for project updates. You should give him a chance." Pearl wanted to scream, wanted to tell Linda that she'd already given Ray every chance, and he'd crushed them all. Instead, she smiled tightly and said she preferred to keep things professional. Linda walked away, shaking her head, convinced Pearl was throwing away opportunity. Pearl came home from work one evening and found Dahlia at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, college applications. Her daughter's face was drawn with exhaustion and something that looked like determination mixed with despair. "Financial aid forms," Dahlia said without looking up. "They want to know about my father, his income, his assets, whether he contributes to my support." Pearl's blood went cold. She'd known this was coming, had dreaded it, but confronting the reality felt like swallowing glass. "Leave it blank," she said. "I can't. They need both parents' information to calculate aid. If I leave it blank, they assume he's contributing, that we're hiding assets." Dahlia's voice cracked. "Mama, I need more scholarship money. The one I have covers tuition, but college has so many other costs. If they think we have money, we don't have. I'll figure it out." "How?" Dahlia stood up, and Pearl saw her daughter properly for the first time in weeks. Too thin, shadows under her eyes from studying too late and worrying too early. "You're already working yourself to death. Azalea's working 2 jobs. Magnolia gave up her dreams entirely. And for what? So I can go to school? So I can be the one success story while everyone else drowns?" "Don't you dare," Pearl said fiercely. "Don't you dare feel guilty for being brilliant, for taking the opportunities you've earned. Your sisters chose to support you because they love you, not because anyone forced them." "But it's not fair." Dahlia's composure cracked completely, tears streaming down her face. "It's not fair that I get everything while they get nothing. It's not fair that we have to sacrifice and struggle while our father has everything and gives us nothing. Why didn't he want us, Mama? What's wrong with us?" Pearl pulled her daughter into her arms, feeling Dahlia's thin frame shake with sobs. "Nothing. There's nothing wrong with any of you. The flaw was in him, his weakness, his cowardice, his absolute failure to be who he should have been." They stood there in the kitchen that was too small, in the apartment that was too expensive, for what it offered, holding each other while dreams and reality warred in the silence. Pearl knew what she had to do, hated it, dreaded it, but her daughter needed information only one person could provide. She spent the next day rehearsing what she would say, practiced keeping her voice level, her request businesslike. She couldn't let Ray see how much it cost her to ask him for anything. Couldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing she still needed something from him, even if it was just paperwork. The next day, she waited until the site meeting ended, until the room cleared, until only she and Ray remained. He looked at her, with that hopeful, guilty expression that made her want to scream. "I need something from you," she said without preamble. "Anything. Information for college financial aid forms. That's all. Just paperwork. You don't have to contribute. Don't have to be involved. Just documentation so my daughter can access the aid she needs." Ray's face went white. "Your daughter, the baby. How?" "Babies," Pearl corrected, watching him absorb this. "Triplets. Girls. You have 3 daughters who've never known anything but struggle because you rejected them before they were born. Now one of them needs documentation for college, and I'm setting aside my pride to get it for her." "3," Ray whispered. "I have 3 daughters." "No," Pearl said sharply. "I have 3 daughters. You have nothing. You're just a name on a birth certificate. A biological fact, nothing more. Pearl, please, let me help. Let me—" "Documentation," she cut him off. "That's all I'm asking. Send it to my office. Don't try to contact them. Don't try to insert yourself into their lives. You made your choice. They've survived without you. They don't need you now." She left before he could respond, before he could make promises or offers, or any of the things men like him thought could substitute for having been there when it mattered. The documentation arrived 2 days later, delivered professionally through his lawyer. No note, no explanation, just numbers on paper that represented everything he'd denied them. Pearl filled out the financial aid forms with shaking hands, writing his income in spaces that made mockery of their poverty. The numbers were obscene. He made in a month what she made in years, had made it the entire time her daughters were growing up hungry. The contrast was so stark, it felt like violence. Dahlia would get her aid now, would have opportunities, but the cost of asking had left. Pearl feeling raw and exposed, as if she'd surrendered something she couldn't afford to lose. She'd promised herself she'd never need anything from Ray Collins again, and here she was, breaking that promise for her daughter's future. Ray kept coming to meetings, but something had changed. He looked haunted now, distracted. He'd learned he had daughters, and the knowledge sat on him like weight. He made mistakes in presentations, forgot details, stared at Pearl with an intensity that made her co-workers whisper even more. Pearl felt no satisfaction in his suffering. She felt nothing but exhaustion and the hollow victory of securing paperwork, while protecting her daughters from the man who'd failed them before they existed. She caught him once, standing in the parking lot after a meeting, just staring at nothing. His expensive car sat nearby, but he didn't move toward it. Just stood there like a man who'd lost something and couldn't remember where he'd left it. Pearl walked past without acknowledging him, but she felt his brokenness follow her like a shadow. Good, she thought viciously. Let him break. Let him finally understand what he threw away. But the thought brought no comfort. Only the tired recognition that some wounds never heal. They just learn to exist alongside you, permanent as scars. Chapter 7. The Daughter's Discovery. Dahlia found the birth certificate while searching for documents to submit with her college enrollment. She'd been in her mother's room, looking through the old filing box where Pearl kept important papers. Insurance cards, social security documents, the detritus of bureaucratic existence, and there, beneath immunization records and old tax forms, 3 birth certificates bound together with a rubber band that had lost its elasticity. She pulled hers out first, her name spelled in official typewriter font, her mother's name in the designated space, and in the space marked Father, Raymond Theodore Collins. The name meant nothing for approximately 5 seconds, just letters arranged in a particular order. Then Dahlia's brilliant mind made the connection her mother had spent years preventing. She Googled the name on her phone, her hands shaking so badly she had to type it 3 times before getting it right. The first result showed his face, older than it would have been when her mother knew him, but unmistakable. The angle of his jaw that Dahlia saw every time she looked in the mirror, the shape of his eyes that Magnolia inherited, the set of his shoulders that made Azalea look like she was always ready to fight. Raymond Collins, billionaire, CEO, the man who had everything while they'd had nothing. Dahlia made a sound she didn't recognize, something between a laugh and a scream. Her phone fell from suddenly nerveless fingers. She stared at the birth certificate like it might change, if she looked hard enough, rewrite itself into something less devastating. But the name stayed, the truth stayed. Her father wasn't some tragic figure who died or disappeared. He was alive and successful and apparently committed to charitable causes, according to his company's website. She grabbed her sister's birth certificates. Checked. Same name. Raymond Theodore Collins, listed as father to Azalea White, Magnolia White, Dahlia White. He'd known they existed, at least enough to be named on legal documents, which meant everything their mother had told them about him walking away wasn't metaphorical. He'd literally known about them and chosen to have nothing to do with them anyway. Dahlia found Azalea first. Her sister was between shifts, sleeping on the couch in the living room. Dahlia shook her awake with trembling hands. "I found him," she said. "Our father. I know who he is." Azalea came awake instantly, that warrior instinct kicking in. "What are you talking about?" "Raymond Collins. Google him." Dahlia's voice broke. He's rich, Azalea. He has everything. And he gave us nothing. They found Magnolia in her room, sketching as always. She looked up when they entered, and whatever she saw in their faces made her put down her pencil immediately. Dahlia showed her the birth certificates, the Google results, the timeline that made everything make sense. Magnolia went very still, her gentle face hardening into something Dahlia had never seen before. He knew, Magnolia said softly. All this time, he knew we existed. We need to tell Mama, Azalea said, but Dahlia shook her head. She kept this from us for a reason. Protected us from knowing we had a father who could have helped and chose not to. We can't confront her about this, not yet. We need to process it first. They sat together in Magnolia's small room, 3 daughters, learning they'd been rejected by a man with the means to have made their lives immeasurably easier. The poverty they'd endured wasn't inevitable. It was chosen, not by their mother who'd fought for them, but by the man who'd helped create them and then walked away. Azalea's rage was immediate and pure. She paced like a caged animal, her hands clenching and unclenching. I want to find him. I want to look him in the face and ask why we weren't worth anything to him. We should leave it alone, Magnolia said, but her voice lacked conviction. Mama kept the secret to protect us. Maybe we should respect that. No, Dahlia said, her brilliant mind already working through scenarios. We have a right to answers, to know why he threw us away. It's not about money or what he could have done. It's about understanding why we weren't enough. They researched him obsessively over the following days. Read articles about his success, his philanthropy, his reputation for innovative design. They found photos of him at charity galas, at industry awards, at groundbreaking ceremonies, living a life so removed from theirs that it seemed impossible they shared DNA. Each sister absorbed the information differently. Azalea compiled a mental list of every luxury he enjoyed while they'd gone without basics. Every expensive dinner was a month of their grocery budget. Every tailored suit was a year of their second-hand clothes. Every award ceremony was time he could have spent knowing them. Her anger crystallized into something sharp and focused, a blade she would eventually use to cut him with truth. Magnolia sketched him obsessively from the photos she found online, drew his face over and over, trying to understand the man who'd rejected them. She filled pages with variations of his expression, searching for some hint of regret or humanity. But every sketch came out the same, cold, distant, a stranger who happened to share their features. She realized she wasn't drawing to understand him. She was drawing to remember exactly what abandonment looked like. Dahlia approached it like a research project, creating spreadsheets comparing their childhood expenses to his wealth. The numbers made her physically ill. He could have changed everything with what he spent on a single vacation. Could have given them security, education, opportunity, with barely a dent in his fortune. Instead, he'd hoarded everything while they'd scrambled for scraps. The injustice of it wasn't just cruel. It was mathematical, quantifiable, unforgivable. Look at this, Dahlia said one night, showing her sisters an article about Ray funding a scholarship program for underprivileged youth. He gives money to strangers' children, while his own daughters had nothing. He photographs well with other people's kids, while we grew up not knowing his face. That's worse than just abandoning us, Azalea said, her voice tight with fury. He pretends to care about poverty, while ignoring the poverty he created. He built his reputation on helping people like us, while making sure we stayed exactly where we were. Magnolia was quieter, but her pain ran just as deep. I keep wondering if he ever thought about us, if he saw girls our age and wondered if one of them was his daughter, or if he trained himself not to see us at all, not to imagine us, not to care. They discovered he'd been at community events in their own neighborhood, groundbreaking ceremonies for projects Pearl had worked on. He'd been within blocks of them, maybe passed them on the street and never known. Or worse, known and not cared enough to look. Dahlia discovered his schedule through her scholarship connections. The elite private school she attended had networks that reached into every corner of wealthy society. She learned he'd be at a charity gala honoring community development initiatives. The kind of event where powerful people congratulated themselves for caring about poverty while wearing clothes that cost more than most people made in a month. "We should go," Dahlia told her sisters. "Not to make a scene, not to ask for anything, just to let him see us, to know we exist and survived without him. How do we even get in?" Magnolia asked. Dahlia smiled, but it wasn't a happy expression. "Scholarship kids are sometimes invited to these things. Token diversity. I can get us on the list. Say you're my guests." Azalea wanted to fight, to scream, to make him hurt the way they'd hurt. Magnolia wanted to show him the art he'd missed, the beauty they'd created despite his absence. Dahlia wanted to prove they were brilliant and resilient and everything he'd lost by walking away. Different motivations, same need. To be seen by the man who'd made them invisible. They told their mother they were attending a school event. Pearl was exhausted from work, from navigating her own encounters with Ray, and didn't question too closely. The girls dressed in thrift store formal wear that Magnolia altered to fit properly. They looked at themselves in the mirror before leaving and saw 3 versions of survival staring back. At the gala, they moved through crowds of wealth with the careful precision of people who knew they didn't belong, but refused to act like it. Dahlia spotted him on stage, accepting some humanitarian award. The irony was so thick she could taste it. A humanitarian who'd abandoned his own children. They waited until after his speech, until he'd descended from the stage and was surrounded by admirers. Then they approached, 3 daughters claiming space in their father's world for the first time. 3 faces that were somehow his face reflected back, softer and feminine and impossible to deny. Ray Collins looked at them and went absolutely still. Whatever he'd been saying died in his throat. His eyes moved from face to face to face, recognition and horror dawning in equal measure. Azalea spoke first, her voice steady despite the rage beneath. "We're the children you threw away. We thought you should know we survived anyway." Chapter 8. The Mirror Breaks. Ray Collins stood paralyzed in the middle of a charity gala where hundreds of people celebrated his generosity. The humanitarian award felt suddenly heavy in his hands, a physical weight made of metal and hypocrisy. 3 young women stood before him, and their faces were his judgment made flesh. He saw Constance in the curve of one's cheek, saw his own mother in the set of another's jaw, saw himself in all 3 of them, undeniable genetics that he couldn't rationalize away. They were beautiful. That was his first coherent thought. Beautiful in the way survivors are beautiful, carrying their scars like armor. They looked at him with expressions that made him feel transparent, as if they could see through his expensive suit to the coward underneath. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" He tried for confusion, for plausible deniability, even as his heart hammered against his ribs, because he knew. God, he knew. "Don't," the first one said, the one with fierce eyes that seemed to dare him to lie. "Don't insult us by pretending you don't understand. We're Pearl White's daughters. Your daughters. Though I suppose that second part requires actually being a father, not just contributing DNA." Heads were turning now, conversations stuttering to stops around them. Ray's publicist appeared at his elbow, her professional smile frozen in place. The moment was becoming spectacle, and Ray couldn't seem to move or speak or do anything but stare at these 3 lives he'd helped create, and then abandoned. "Mr. Collins has a tight schedule," his publicist began, but the second young woman, this one with artist's hands and sad eyes, stepped forward with something in her grasp. "I brought you a gift," she said quietly. She opened a portfolio filled with drawings. Flowers rendered in heartbreaking detail, each one labeled in careful script. Azalea, Magnolia, Dahlia, these are our names. Mama named us after flowers because she said we were beautiful things, growing in impossible places. I thought you should see what bloomed from what you threw away. She handed him the portfolio and stepped back. Ray looked down at the drawings and felt something crack in his chest. The artistry was stunning, professional quality, The kind of talent that should have been nurtured in the best schools, with the best teachers. Instead, this girl had developed it in whatever stolen moments poverty allowed. The third one, with calculating eyes that reminded him uncomfortably of himself, pulled out papers. "My valedictorian speech," she said, "about succeeding without privilege, without connections, without a father. I thought you might want to read it. Since you're being honored for helping disadvantaged youth tonight." The irony landed like a slap. Ray finally found his voice, though it emerged hoarse and uncertain. "Please, can we go somewhere private? Talk about this properly." "No," Azalea said. "You don't get privacy. You don't get the chance to spin this or control it. We came here to let you see us, to know that we exist, that we survived, that Mama raised 3 successful daughters despite everything you did to destroy her." "I didn't know," Ray said desperately, "about the 3 of you. I only recently learned." "You knew enough," Dahlia interrupted. "You knew Mama was pregnant when you fired her, when you blacklisted her, when you made sure she couldn't work in her field. You knew you were destroying someone who carried your child, and you did it anyway. Finding out there were 3 of us instead of 1 doesn't make you less guilty. It just makes you 3 times the coward." People were definitely watching now. Phones were emerging from pockets. This would be online within minutes, his humanitarian award juxtaposed with daughters claiming abandonment. Ray's publicist was pale, whispering urgently into her own phone. Security was moving closer. "What do you want?" Ray asked, because men like him always assumed everyone wanted something. Money, recognition, some piece of what he'd built. Magnolia laughed softly. "We don't want anything from you. That's what you can't understand. We're not here for support or acknowledgement or whatever guilt-driven offer you're about to make. We're here because there's a hole in our identity, and we needed to see you to understand it." "And do you?" Ray's voice cracked. "Understand it?" "Yes," Azalea said. "We understand that you were weak, that you let other people tell you what to think instead of trusting your own heart, that you chose comfort over courage and money over morality. We understand exactly who you are now." She turned to leave, her sisters following. Ray reached out instinctively, catching Azalea's arm. She looked down at his hand on her sleeve, then up at his face with such contempt that he dropped his grip immediately. "Don't ever touch me," she said. "You lost the right to call us your daughters. We're strangers who happen to share your DNA. Remember that if you ever think about trying to insert yourself into our lives." They walked away through the crowd that parted for them like water. Ray stood frozen, the humanitarian award still in his hands, while whispers rose around him like a tide. His publicist was already doing damage control, but Ray barely heard her. He was watching 3 daughters disappear into the night, taking with them any illusion he'd built about the kind of man he was. The gala dissolved into chaos around him. Donors whispered behind their hands. Board members pulled him aside with tight smiles and tighter warnings. The photographer who'd been documenting the event for the Foundation's website quietly deleted photos, but it was too late. A dozen guests had already captured the confrontation on their phones. Ray's publicist steered him toward a back exit, her voice low and urgent. "We need to get ahead of this. Issue a statement. Frame the narrative before it gets away from us." But Ray couldn't speak, couldn't think. The portfolio Magnolia had given him was still in his hands, and he opened it again in the car. Each drawing was a masterpiece. Each flower contained multitudes of detail he'd never noticed in real blooms. His daughter had this gift, this extraordinary talent, and she'd developed it without resources, without training, without him. Dahlia's valedictorian speech was typed on cheap paper, the kind that came from a printer running low on ink. He read it by the dim light of his phone screen, and each word was a knife. She wrote about resilience, about proving your worth to yourself when the world said you were worthless, about success that tasted sweeter because it was earned through suffering rather than handed down through privilege. She never named him. Didn't have to. Every line was about him, about what he'd done by doing nothing. about the father-shaped hole she'd learned to fill with determination and spite, and the kind of strength that only comes from having no other choice. Later, when the gala had dissolved into chaos and Ray sat alone in his car, he pulled out his phone and looked up their names. Azalea White, Magnolia White, Dahlia White. He found Dahlia's name on scholarship lists, academic achievement awards. Found Magnolia's art featured in a small online gallery. Found nothing about Azalea except a brief mention in a workplace safety article about underage workers. They were extraordinary. That's what killed him. They were brilliant and talented and resilient, everything he would have been proud to claim if he hadn't been too cowardly to claim them when it mattered. He thought about Pearl raising them alone, about the poverty they must have endured, about the sacrifices they'd made while he'd had everything. The photos from the gala were already online. His face pale and shocked, staring at three young women who looked enough like him that no one could deny the connection. The captions were brutal. Humanitarian accused of abandoning his own children. Billionaire confronted by daughters he rejected. The narrative was writing itself, and Ray had no defense because everything they'd said was true. His phone exploded with notifications. Text messages from board members demanding explanations. Emails from lawyers advising silence. Voice messages from colleagues suddenly too busy to meet. The Harrington family, Constance's relatives who'd pushed him to reject Pearl, were notably silent. They'd gotten what they wanted years ago and would distance themselves from this scandal now that it threatened their own reputations. Ray scrolled through social media and watched his life unravel in real time. Someone had posted Dahlia's valedictorian speech. Someone else had shared Magnolia's art with commentary about talent surviving despite negligent fathers. The story was spreading, mutating, growing beyond his ability to contain it. His humanitarian award was now a punchline. His reputation for generosity now looked like performance art masking deeper cruelty. He drove home to his empty house filled with expensive furniture that meant nothing, looked at walls covered with awards and accolades that suddenly felt like accusations. He'd built an empire and lost everything that mattered. And the worst part, the part that made him want to put his fist through his own reflection, was that he had no one to blame but himself. His phone rang. His publicist, his lawyers, his board members, all calling to discuss damage control. Ray ignored them all. He sat in the dark and thought about three daughters named for flowers, blooming despite him, beautiful despite everything. And he understood that some betrayals were too complete for redemption. Some doors once closed could never be opened again. He'd slammed that door himself, and now he'd have to live with what was on the other side of it. He opened Magnolia's portfolio again, studying each drawing in the silence of his empty house. She'd signed each one, small modest signatures in the corner. Magnolia White, not Collins. Never Collins. They'd taken Pearl's name, claimed her identity, rejected his completely. Even on legal documents where he was listed as father, they'd chosen to be Whites, to belong to the woman who'd raised them, rather than the man who'd abandoned them. Ray set the portfolio on his coffee table and stared at it until dawn broke through his windows. Those drawings would haunt him more than any headline or lost contract ever could. They were evidence of what he'd thrown away, proof that brilliance and beauty and talent had been within his reach, and he'd chosen to let it all slip through his fingers because he was too weak to hold on when holding on required courage. Chapter 9. The Unraveling. Ray Collins stopped sleeping. Night after night he lay in his bed, a bed that cost more than most people's cars, and stared at the ceiling while three faces haunted him. Azalea's rage, Magnolia's sorrow, Dahlia's cold assessment. They rotated through his mind on an endless loop, each memory worse than the last. He hired investigators, not to interfere but to understand, to know the full scope of what Pearl had endured, what his daughters had survived. The reports arrived in neat folders that felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Each page was a new revelation of his failure. Pearl evicted while pregnant. Pearl working night shifts while nursing triplets. Pearl's architectural career destroyed by whispers he'd started, by doors he'd helped close. The blacklist had been thorough, effective. He'd wielded his reputation like a weapon and gutted someone brilliant because it was easier than being brave. The investigators found Azalea's employment records. She'd been working since before it was legal, lying about her age to help pay bills. Multiple jobs, long hours, injuries at workplaces that didn't follow safety regulations because they knew undocumented workers wouldn't complain. His daughter had sacrificed her childhood to feed herself and her sisters while he'd been photographed at restaurants where a single meal cost more than their monthly grocery budget. They found Magnolia's art school acceptance letter, the one she'd turned down, the scholarship she'd walked away from so her sister could have supplies. They found her working at a flower shop for minimum wage, her talent wasted arranging bouquets for people who never noticed the artistry in how she placed each stem. They found Dahlia's academic records, perfect grades achieved while hungry, scholarships earned through exhaustion and determination, college applications where she'd had to explain her father's absence in essays that made Ray physically ill to read. His daughter had written about overcoming abandonment, about proving she had value despite being unwanted. She'd turned trauma into fuel for success, and Ray had been the trauma. He learned about the apartment they'd lived in with Pearl's sister. The noise, the violence in the building, the nights when there wasn't enough food, the winters when heat was a luxury they couldn't afford. All of this happening within 20 miles of his house with its heated pool and wine cellar and rooms he never used. The guilt became a physical presence in his chest. Ray stopped going to the office. His assistant fielded calls from concerned board members. His doctor prescribed medication that Ray didn't take because he felt he deserved the insomnia, the weight loss, the way his hands shook when he tried to hold a pen. He started showing up at Pearl's office, not for project meetings, those he sent subordinates to handle. He just appeared, standing outside her building, trying to gather courage to go inside. Sometimes Pearl saw him. She never acknowledged it, just walked past like he was invisible, carrying herself with a dignity that made his shame more acute. Once, he managed to catch her in the parking lot. "Please," he said, "please let me explain." Pearl stopped walking but didn't turn around. "Explain what?" "How you destroyed my career, how you left me homeless while pregnant, how you made sure I'd never work as an architect again. I've read your explanation already. It was written in every job rejection, every empty bank account, every night my daughters went to bed hungry." "I was wrong," Ray said. "I was grieving and angry, and I let Constance's family poison me against you. But that's not an excuse. Nothing excuses what I did. I just want you to know that I see it now. I understand what I took from you, from them. Understanding doesn't give me back those years," Pearl said. "It doesn't undo the damage. You're not suffering for my benefit, Ray. You're suffering because you finally have to face who you are. That's not my burden to ease." She walked away, leaving him standing in the parking lot like a ghost, unable to leave the scene of his own crime. Ray drove home and found himself pulling out old photo albums from storage, pictures of himself and Constance, back when they were young and believed they'd have children. They'd picked out names, talked about schools, dreamed about who their kids would become. Then cancer had taken those dreams, and Ray had convinced himself he was honoring Constance by protecting her memory from complications. But looking at those photos now, he knew Constance would have been horrified by his choices. She'd loved Pearl, had blessed their relationship, had wanted Ray to be happy and loved after she was gone. He'd betrayed both women, had turned Constance's dying wish into justification for cruelty, had used grief as an excuse for cowardice. And now he had 3 daughters who would never know him, who had every right to want nothing to do with him. Ray tried to work, tried to focus on the empire he'd built, but numbers on spreadsheets seemed meaningless. Buildings he'd designed felt hollow. Awards collecting dust in his office mocked him with their inscriptions about vision and leadership. He'd been blind and cowardly where it mattered most. His board noticed his deterioration, called meetings about his fitness to lead. Ray sat through them feeling detached, as if they were discussing someone else. They talked about the PR disaster of the gala, about damage to the company's reputation. They wanted him to issue a statement, deny the allegations, claim the young women were opportunists seeking money from his success. No, Ray said quietly. Everything they said was true. I abandoned them. I destroyed their mother's career. They're my daughters, and I failed them completely. I won't compound that by calling them liars. His honesty stunned the room into silence. The board went into emergency session. Ray didn't care. Let them remove him. Let the empire crumble. What good was any of it if he'd built it on the ruins of his own children's childhoods? He went home and wrote letters he'd never send. To Pearl, apologizing for everything. To Azalea, admiring her strength. To Magnolia, praising her art. To Dahlia, acknowledging her brilliance. He wrote them and burned them, because words on paper couldn't bridge the gap he'd created. Some chasms were too wide for bridges. The nightmares started. Ray would dream of 3 small girls in a dark apartment, crying for a father who never came. He'd wake gasping, his sheets soaked with sweat, the guilt crushing his chest until he couldn't breathe. During the day, he'd catch glimpses of young women who resembled his daughters and feel his heart stutter. Every flower reminded him of their names. Every achievement headline made him wonder if Dahlia had earned another award he'd never witness. He visited the neighborhood where they'd grown up, stood outside the building where they'd lived, staring at windows that had once framed their childhoods. The playground where Azalea had probably fought battles to protect her sisters. The library where Dahlia had discovered worlds beyond poverty. The flower shop where Magnolia had worked, her talent hidden among common arrangements. Ray understood with devastating clarity that he'd had everything and chosen nothing, had been offered love and family and a second chance at fatherhood, and had rejected it all because he was too weak to disappoint people who didn't matter. The Harringtons had moved on years ago, barely remembered him now. But his daughters would carry his abandonment forever. He started having chest pains. His doctor warned him about stress, about the physical toll of sustained guilt and insomnia. Ray listened with detached interest, as if they were discussing someone else's failing body. Part of him welcomed the pain. Physical suffering felt appropriate, a small payment against the debt he could never repay. Weeks passed. Ray became a shadow of himself, haunted by the realization that he'd won every professional success while failing the only test that mattered. He'd chosen reputation over responsibility, comfort over courage, and now he was wealthy and successful and completely, utterly alone with the knowledge of what he'd thrown away. His daughters were moving forward with their lives. He saw glimpses through careful online searches, Dahlia's name on Dean's lists, Magnolia's art in small exhibitions. Even Azalea, finally enrolled in nursing school, pursuing dreams she should have been able to chase years earlier. They were thriving despite him, and Ray understood that his presence in their lives would only contaminate their success with his failure. The diagnosis came on a Thursday: cancer, the same disease that had taken Constance. Aggressive, advanced. His doctor spoke about treatment options, about survival rates, about fighting. Ray heard the words through cotton, understanding that karma had finally caught up with him. He was dying the same way his wife had died, and somehow that felt like the universe closing a circle he'd tried to keep open through cruelty. 6 months, the doctor said. Maybe less without aggressive treatment. Maybe more with it. Ray nodded and scheduled the appointments he had no intention of keeping. He'd spent years running from consequences. He wouldn't run from this one. He'd wanted redemption, but redemption required forgiveness he had no right to ask for. So Ray sat with his guilt and his regret and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. He'd destroyed something precious, and no amount of remorse could rebuild it. That was his punishment. Not hatred from his daughters, but their indifference, their ability to succeed without him. Their lives continuing beautifully while he remained frozen in the moment. He realized everything he'd lost. The cancer progressed quickly, as if his body had been waiting for permission to give up. Ray handled his affairs mechanically, setting up trusts, organizing documents, preparing to exit a world he'd stopped deserving to inhabit. And through it all, 3 faces haunted him. 3 daughters he'd never know. 3 flowers blooming in a garden he'd never walk through. 3 lives that proved you didn't need a father to survive. You just needed to be stronger than his weakness. Chapter 10. The Garden Reborn. Pearl White stood in the reception area of her own architectural firm and felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. Pride that wasn't laced with exhaustion. Success that didn't taste like sacrifice. The office was small, nothing like the empire Ray had built, but it was hers. Built on recovered reputation, on word of mouth from clients who valued talent over connections, on years of clawing back what had been stolen from her. The walls displayed blueprints of projects she'd completed. Community centers, affordable housing complexes, schools in neighborhoods that rarely got architectural attention. She'd rebuilt her career from ashes, and this time she'd done it on her own terms, designing spaces for people who needed them, rather than just those who could afford them. Azalea was finishing her final semester of nursing school. Not just finishing, excelling. She'd found her calling in emergency medicine, drawn to the intensity and the opportunity to fight for people at their most vulnerable. Magnolia's botanical illustrations had been featured in a prestigious journal, her art finally receiving recognition it had always deserved. Dahlia was thriving in university, still brilliant, still driven, but with the scholarships and support she needed to succeed without her family drowning to keep her afloat. They'd built this together. The 4 of them, a family forged in fire, tempered by struggle, stronger for having survived what should have destroyed them. Pearl looked at her daughters and saw women who'd inherited resilience instead of wealth, who'd learned that survival was its own currency, who understood their worth wasn't dependent on anyone's validation. The office door opened. Pearl turned, expecting a client, but Ray Collins walked in instead. She tensed immediately, her body remembering betrayal even as her mind calculated escape routes. But something about him stopped her. He looked diminished, sick, like someone carrying weight that was crushing him from the inside. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just need 5 minutes. If you still want me to leave after that, I will." Pearl almost refused. Almost called security. But curiosity, and perhaps some small surviving piece of compassion, made her nod toward her office. Ray followed, moving like someone much older than he was. He sat across from her desk and placed a folder on its surface. "What's this?" Pearl's voice was cautious. "Paperwork. Deeds to properties in trust for each of them. College funds. Medical information they need to know about genetic conditions. Legal documents establishing everything I should have given them from the beginning." He paused, his voice rough. "I'm dying, Pearl, 6 months, maybe less, cancer. Ironic considering." Pearl felt nothing at this revelation. No sympathy, no satisfaction, just exhaustion at this man's continued presence in her orbit. "Why are you telling me?" "Because they deserve to know their medical history, to make informed health decisions. Because there are genetic factors that run in my family, heart conditions, certain cancers, that they should monitor." He pushed the folder closer. "And because I wanted to handle my estate properly. Make sure loose ends don't complicate their lives after I'm gone." "How generous," Pearl said, her tone flat. "Providing in death what you refused to give in life." "I know how it sounds," Ray said. "I know it doesn't fix anything. But I couldn't die knowing I'd left them with even more problems to solve. The money is theirs to use or burn. Their choice. I'm not trying to buy forgiveness or absolution. I just don't want my death to burden them the way my life did." Pearl opened the folder and saw numbers that made her dizzy. Amounts that could have changed everything. That could have prevented every hungry night, every sacrifice, every moment of desperation. She closed it, pushing it back across the desk. "Tell them yourself," she said. "I'm done being your intermediary. If you want them to know about their medical history, If you want to explain these documents, you face them. Not me. They won't see me. Can you blame them? Pearl's voice hardened. You rejected them before they were born. Showed up at a gala they attended to finally confront you. And now, dying, you want to hand them money like that somehow makes up for missing their entire lives. No, Ray said quietly. Nothing makes up for it. I just wanted to minimize the damage my death might cause. But you're right. They deserve the choice to hear this directly or not hear it at all. He stood, moving slowly. I'm sorry, Pearl, for everything. I know it's inadequate. I know sorry is just a word. But I needed to say it one more time. Pearl watched him walk toward her office door and felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness, not sympathy, but perhaps the final letting go of rage that had sustained her through impossible years. Ray, she called. He turned back. The girls are extraordinary despite you, not because of you. Whatever you leave behind doesn't change what you took from them. It doesn't give them back the childhoods they deserved. It doesn't undo the nights I held them while they cried about not being wanted. I know, he said, accepting this truth with visible pain, but they deserve the choice to know you, even if it's just to say goodbye to something they never really had. I'll tell them you came. What they do with that information isn't my decision anymore. They're not children I can protect from hurt. They're women who survived your abandonment. Whatever they choose, I'll stand beside them. Ray nodded, understanding this was more than he deserved. He left the folder on her desk and walked out of her office, out of her building, taking with him nothing but the weight of irreversible choices. Pearl called her daughters. They came to her office that evening, all three of them, pulling chairs around her desk. She told them about Ray's visit, about the medical information, about the money he'd left in trust. What do you want to do? Pearl asked, giving them the choice she'd never had. Azalea spoke first. I want the medical information. Not for him, for me, for my future. I refuse to let his genetics blindside me the way his cowardice did. Magnolia touched the folder carefully. I don't know if I want to see him, but I think I need to. Not for closure. I don't believe in that. But to know, I gave him the chance to explain before it's too late. Dahlia was quiet for a long moment, her brilliant mind working through scenarios. Finally, she looked at Pearl. What do you want, Mama? I want whatever gives you peace, Pearl said honestly. I want you to make the choice that feels right. This is about you. They decided together. One meeting, one chance for Ray to explain, to answer questions, to face them before death provided escape. They met in Pearl's office, with Pearl present as witness. Ray arrived looking worse than before. He saw his daughters together for the first time in a context that wasn't confrontation and seemed overwhelmed. The conversation lasted hours. Ray answered questions honestly, about why he'd rejected Pearl, about his wife's family's influence, about the cowardice that had let him destroy someone he loved. When Ray finished, they sat in silence. I don't forgive you, Azalea said. But I'll take the medical information and the money because I earned it through every hard year you weren't there. I want to paint you, Magnolia said, before you die, so I remember exactly who you are. I'll use the money for medical school, Dahlia said. Become a doctor. Your wealth will fund the life you tried to prevent. Ray accepted their terms. In his remaining months, he gave them what he could. Medical histories. Stories about his family. Answers to questions they'd carried. But he never asked for love or forgiveness. When Ray died, his daughters attended the funeral as strangers honoring a biological connection. They felt no grief, just quiet acknowledgement that this chapter had closed. The money became tools for building futures he'd never see. Azalea opened a clinic in their old neighborhood. Magnolia started an art program for children in poverty. Dahlia funded scholarships for students whose parents had abandoned them. Years later, Pearl stood in her daughter's gardens and understood that survival itself was the victory. Ray had thrown them away, and they'd grown anyway. He'd lost them through his own choices, and that loss was his punishment. Their success was their redemption. The garden Pearl had planted in the wasteland had grown beyond anyone's ability to destroy it. beautiful and permanent, rooted in love that transcended every failure that tried to kill it.